G'day, I'm Rowan Mackey and welcome to Individuate, the podcast about developing perspective by learning about human psychology and the world around us. You will have noticed a bit of a different start for the podcast today, and that's because today's podcast is going to be the first of a slight change of emphasis here on the podcast. I'll be explaining in a bit more detail why that is today, but I've called today's episode Pursuing Perspective, because essentially, from here on in, that's what the podcast will be about, the pursuit of perspective. Partly because that's what I'm most interested in, and also because for those of you who do have a podcast, once you've got all the tips, tricks and systems you can get on the internet, mostly for free I might add, a broader perspective is how to improve your podcast. It'll make it more accessible and more interesting to more people if you can access a deeper level of understanding across the board. But it's not just about podcasting, as we'll discuss today. And as I flagged at the end of last week's podcast, I've got a new project to tell you about, which will be focused on some of the practicalities of podcasting. Leaving some of the pragmatic elements of podcasting for that project will allow us to focus a bit more on the perspective side of podcasting. So from today's episode, we can really get into the meat and potatoes of individuation, because that's what I consider to be the most interesting stuff. Just to flag it with you too, today's episode might include a little bit of deeper thinking. This won't be the case with every episode going forward, as I'll lay out at the end of today's podcast. But I want to give you some insight into the podcast's deeper mission and how it will affect the content going forward. Then we'll bring it back to the practical application at the end. But I'm keen to explore some of the deeper psychological elements that have popped up from the podcast so far. Before I do that though, I actually want to tell you 3 stories today. Each I think give us a clue into what's involved in developing perspective. They're each going to give us a different clue into some of the elements that we can take and talk about in future episodes. So firstly, let's talk about the time that the entire football world was touched by the hand of God. It was 6 minutes into the second half of the 1986 World Cup quarter-final. England and Argentina were locked at 0-0 in an extremely tense affair, just 4 years after the end of the Falklands War. The game was played in an atmosphere of a bitter political backdrop between the two countries, and being a World Cup quarter-final, there was absolutely everything at stake. Argentine icon and footballing maestro Diego Maradona takes the ball in midfield, about 60 yards from the English goal. Pirouetting past English defender Glenn Hoddle, he fires off a pass at the top of the box to Argentine striker Jorge Valdano. Valdano, quickly set upon by 3 English defenders, attempts to control the ball, but instead flicks it up in the air. English defender Steve Hodge attempts to clear the ball, but instead only manages to pop the ball back up in the air towards his own goal. Sensing the danger, English goalkeeper Peter Shilton rushes out to catch the ball, but Maradona had also sensed the opportunity and found himself alone with the English goalkeeper in the penalty box. Had the ball come off Valdano, Maradona would have been caught offside, but having come off an English leg, he was allowed his opportunity on goal. As the ball dropped down and the 2 players rose up to contest it, it appeared as if Shilton would comfortably swat the ball away. However, Maradona, who was 20 centimetres shorter than Shilton, seemed to levitate prophetically and meet the ball before the goalkeeper was able to get there. As the ball rolled into the back of the net, Maradona ran away celebrating wildly, calling his teammates to join him and suspiciously giving the occasional glance back towards the referee. The English defenders were incensed and immediately remonstrated with referee Ali bin Nasser. On closer inspection, it was obvious that the ball had illegally come off Maradona's outstretched fist. The goal should have been disallowed, but it was not picked up by either the referee or the linesman on duty. Argentine defender Oscar Regueri later said of the incident, "Imagine if it had been the other way around. We would still be chasing the referee today. But some of them, like us, probably thought Diego had beaten the goalkeeper to the ball with his head. Diego even told us that it had been a header. It was genius how he ran off celebrating. With the benefit of hindsight and better technology, we can look back and see that in a perfect world, the goal should not have stood. But the goal was allowed, and is now seen as arguably the most infamous and controversial moment on a sporting pitch anywhere in the world. Argentina actually won the match 2-1, including what became to be known as the goal of the century, where Maradona beat just about every English player to score one of the best goals of all time, just a short 4 minutes after his infamous outstretched arm. Gary Lineker pulled one back late for the English, but it wasn't enough, and Argentina progressed further into a tournament that they would eventually win, beating West Germany 3-2 in the final. But all anyone ever talks about these days from the 1986 World Cup is the hand of God. Maybe Maradona's second goal too. But it's the hand of God that shines brightest in people's memory. Now, the reason that I want to talk about this goal today is part of why I love sport so much, because it gives us an insight into one of the fundamental principles of spectating sport. And that is that 15 people can all watch the exact same thing, even with the benefit of hindsight and replays, but each of them sees completely different things. On Maradona's goal in the 1986 quarter-final, put yourself in English shoes. The team which went on to win the World Cup only did so because they cheated. On face value, there's no justice in it from the English perspective. This is backed up by English player John Barnes, who sat on the bench when Maradona scored his infamous goal. He said, "We all saw it. All of us on the bench, the players, the coaches, the manager, we all saw it clear as day. We all knew he'd handled the ball. So we just couldn't believe the referee hadn't seen it." English goalkeeper Peter Shilton always remained bitter about his association with the goal. He felt that in some ways it defined his career, and he later said of the incident, "After 30 years in the game, there are a few things that I'm really proud of. The three things that really matter are the most competitive games in professional football because it shows my longevity. Winning 125 caps for England sits alongside it. And the other one is the joint record of most clean sheets in international football along with Fabian Barthez. That obviously would have been my record if it hadn't have been for a certain Mr. Maradona. I did everything I could to stop that handball, and the famous photo shows that I'm closer to the ball than his head. That's why he punched it with his hand." You always have people saying, "Oh, he outjumped you." He didn't outjump me, he cheated. So to be associated with that moment. So to look at the testimony of these two players, and to talk to just about anyone from England, it seems fairly black and white. The hand of God is nothing but an example of cheating. But that's certainly not the case. Maradona always remained unrepentant for his deliberate handball which led to the goal. It wasn't even until 19 years later, in 2005, that he confessed he had touched the ball with his hand, even coining the term hand of God himself. I imagine part of it would have been not wanting to label himself a cheat. But when you look into it, there's more to it than that. As I mentioned before, the game was being played after Argentina had, in their eyes, lost Las Malvinas to the British, which was the Argentinian name for the Falklands. To quote Maradona himself, he admitted that beating the English was a beautiful feeling, a type of symbolic revenge against the English for the loss of Las Malvinas. He has also claimed that he told his teammates that he felt no shame about the deceitful nature of the hand of God. He later recounted, "I said to them, those who steal from a thief are entitled to 100 years of forgiveness, and the English had done a lot of things to us." So to Maradona, although it was an illegal act on the football field, he'd completely justified it ethically. It wasn't about an illegal act on the football field. It was about national pride and avenging Argentina's defeat in the war. In Maradona's eyes, the goal stood, and that's what matters. His reference to divine intervention may be some admission to the fact that it should not have stood, and he's lucky that it did. But Maradona does not see the goal as an act of injustice because of what came after it. For Argentina, and indeed the rest of South America, the goal was a pivotal moment. It brought immense joy to the people of Argentina to have beaten colonialist England, and in a way, it revalidated their national identity after the defeat in the Falklands. The sentiment was iconically summed up by Argentine commentator Victor Hugo Morales, who said in his commentary of the goal, "Maradona goes past three. Incredible, incredible. Touches it for Valdano. Maradona goes on. He jumps with Shilton. He heads. Handball. Goal, goal, goal for Argentina. Diego Armando Maradona went in after a fantastic piece of play. The goal was scored using his hand. I celebrate it with all my soul, but I must say what I think. I hope you tell me from Buenos Aires, if you're watching the game, if the goal was fair. Though the referee has given it, Argentina are leading 1-0. God forgive me for what I'm going to say. Against England today, even like this, with a goal scored with the hand, what do you want me to say?" So to the Argentinians, it didn't matter that the goal was scored with Maradona's hand. It was more than just a goal. It had upended English assumptions of superiority that had been accepted by many people across South America. That was particularly the case in Argentina, where English-speaking communities had reached into the hundreds of thousands by the 1980s. To people in Argentina, it wasn't just a goal. It was a significant cultural event. Even the referee had a completely different perspective about the goal. Ali bin Nasser, who had the whistle for that game in 1986, has always insisted that he was let down by his linesman, Bogdan Doshev. In 2001, he said of the issue, "If you look at the match, you can see that Doshev was in a much better position. I had my doubts, but when I saw the linesman was running towards the centre circle, I gave the goal because I was obliged to follow FIFA's rules." The rules at that time were that the decision of the official with the better vantage point should take precedence. So depending on what your emotional stake in the result of the goal was, people had a completely different emotional reaction. If you were English, it wasn't a goal, it was blatant injustice. For the Argentinians, even though it may not have been a legal goal to the letter of the law, it was an intervention from God that allowed them to freely express as people again. And to the referee, it was the other guy's job. And so he seemed to be the only one along with the linesman who believes the goal should have been awarded. Even though the external cue was exactly the same for everyone mentioned, they each applied their own filter and came up with their own perspective. To me, what this illustrates is the principle that the way we see the world is affected by who we are internally. Our experiences and emotions will affect the way that we interpret or respond to something externally. And so it's important to have an understanding of who we are and what our filter is if we're going to be able to perceive the world with any sense of perceived objectivity. But what also strikes me about this concept is that it's not just a one-way relationship. That is to say, it's not just the way that we feel that affects our perceptions and perspective, but the external world can also affect how we feel. It works two ways. To demonstrate, I want to tell you about how the potato became popular in Prussia. In 1756, King Frederick II of Prussia wanted to find a way to end the prolonged suffering and famine that had fallen upon his people. His solution was a new crop that had recently been discovered in South America, a new crop of food that could be planted bountifully across his kingdom and feed his starving people. That food was the potato. Frederick quickly decreed that potatoes should be planted for everyone across the region. He made sure to let everyone know of the many benefits of the new food, so that they would share his enthusiasm and begin eating the new food excitedly. Unfortunately for all concerned, it wasn't going to plan for the benefactor. Many people were put off from the potato because of its weird, dirty-looking exterior and bland taste. It seemed that the king's plan was going to fail until he had a genius idea. He ordered some of his guards to be sent out to protect the fields of potatoes from thieves. This, in turn, made the villagers curious about what amazing resource the guards were being ordered to guard and hide. Frederick told the soldiers to go easy on those who came to steal the potatoes and deliberately let down their guard so that potatoes could be taken during the night and administered by thieves to the rest of the starving subjects. This increased the popularity of the potato greatly, and before long they were being grown in personal gardens and consumed by many people throughout the kingdom. This, of course, was the king's plan all along. Now, there are so many applications to this story, including in a business sense. I think it's a fascinating example of human psychology in play. But what that story suggests to me is that our perceptions and the way that we feel about things can also be influenced by purely external factors. If how we see Maradona's goal is affected by who we are in a psychological sense, well then King Frederick II's potatoes are an example of who we are in a psychological sense, being influenced by the outer world. Nothing inherently changed about the potatoes before and after people thought that they were worth stealing. All that had happened was that they had gained popularity with a slight shift in perspective. They were just framed differently. So our perspective can be influenced by the makeup of the external world. The way that we feel or perceive something can be influenced by the way that it's presented. But then there's a third point that I want to make about this. That it's not just our psychological perceptions that can be influenced by internal and external factors. It's also our sensory perceptions. That is to say, there can be external factors that can actually change the way that we experience reality. Now, there's a bit to unpick about that. So to help illustrate this concept, I want to tell you about how the BBC turned off gravity. On April the 1st, 1976, English astronomer Sir Patrick Moore pulled off arguably the greatest April Fool's Day prank of all time, managing to fool the people of the UK into thinking they could float. Speaking with BBC Radio 2, he stated that at exactly 9:47 AM, Pluto would pass directly behind Jupiter in relation to the Earth. This would create a noticeable reduction in gravity on the Earth itself. He said that if people jumped at this exact time, they would be overcome by a strange floating sensation. This would be known as the Jovian-Plutonian effect. Knowing what we do about gravity today, this is absolutely ridiculous, but the British public completely fell for it. Coming from a reputable source who had authority, Sir Moore's assertion that the effect would take place was enough to convince many people of its existence. We'll do an episode at a later time on the experiments done by a psychologist Stanley Milgram, because I think they're relevant here. But the gravity prank worked exceedingly well. The BBC reported being inundated with calls from people all over the country, telling them they were having bizarre gravitational experiences. One woman claimed that she and her friends were sitting and had wafted from their chairs and gently orbited around the room. Another woman said that she and her 11 friends were sitting at a table, and soon enough, everyone and the table began to ascend into the air. Of course, once it was revealed as being a hoax, many people were terribly embarrassed, but that doesn't change the fact that people all over the country were calling into the BBC to report that they were floating. To quickly tie off the story, the reason that Moore performed this hoax was really just to raise awareness for the fact that the whole idea of planetary alignment and its effects on the Earth are nonsense. He said of his motivation for the prank, "Let us hear no more about this nonsense of planetary alignment. It happens every 170 years or so. Nothing spectacular will be seen in the sky, and, in the opinion of almost everyone, it can affect nobody and nothing." But what it did affect was people's perceptions that they had floated. Regardless of whether or not they actually had, the people who called the BBC were convinced that they had. Now, what these stories tell me is that we can't really know anything about the outside world without first understanding ourselves and the filters that we apply to our perspective. But then you can't really know anything about yourself without understanding how external factors play a part in our perceptions. So there's a link between the outside world and the inner world that I'm keen to unpack. Because it seems to me that without an understanding of each of these domains, our perspective will always be open to influence. Now, this is some pretty deep stuff, and I just want to reiterate what I said at the start. Going forward, we're very much going to bite off tiny slices of the cherry so that we can actually apply what we learn. Obviously, I want the podcast to be as accessible and entertaining as possible, but what fascinates me about these ideas is that at a much deeper level, they were being discussed by some of the smartest and most influential minds humanity has ever produced. People like Carl Jung, Albert Einstein, Wolfgang Pauli, William James. These are the people who designed a lot of contemporary, accepted rational thought. And they were all interested in the link between the outside world and how our internal world interfaces with it and affects it. In a letter between Nobel Prize winning physicist Wolfgang Pauli, pioneer in the field of quantum physics, and Carl Jung, Pauli said that their correspondence provided serious evidence that what is developing is indicative of a close fusion of psychology with the scientific experience of the processes in the material, physical world. John Archibald Wheeler, the physicist who coined the term black hole, once said, "This is a participatory universe, and observer participancy gives rise to information." Even Albert Einstein, arguably the most famous scientist of all time, said that every true theorist is a kind of tamed metaphysicist. So even though I'll put my hand up and say, I don't understand things to the degree that these great minds did, I don't think we can look at the idea of perspective without considering how our psychology plays a part on what we perceive. We might even get into some of the theoretical and quantum physics that supported these beliefs. But to bring it back to the practical application now, it seems to me that if we want to be able to critically think, we have to be able to understand this relationship. The metaphor that I always come back to is being a good podcast host. Because as I'll discuss shortly, podcasts are such a distillation of perspectives. And even beyond podcasts, in any creative pursuit that we do, practicing creativity is a way to explore some of the link between our inner world and the outer world. It's an interface for some of these ideas. To me, that's what art is. And I think that podcasts are a form of art. So in my opinion, it's important to think about things in these terms. Art is an example of someone's internal representation of a concept. And art and the expression of creativity is one way that we interface with other people's perspectives. This is why the episodes up until now have focused on creative pursuit. Because it's in a creative pursuit that we can interface with and develop these ideas for ourselves. And in order to be creative, as we've spoken about, we have to develop our perspective. This is where I think podcasts are arguably the best creative pursuit when you're looking at perspective alone. Because essentially, what they are is a distilled perspective. That notion is a little bit more straightforward when a podcast is being presented by one person, but even in interviews, podcast interviews are essentially just broadcast conversations, and conversations are just an integration of different perspectives. So this is why I'm so interested in podcasts, because they allow us to interface with so many different perspectives, both as a host and as a listener. And to look at it broadly, I think going forward as a society, we need to find a way to include and benefit from everyone's perspective. Partly because we've got a whole range of subgroups in society saying that their perspective hasn't traditionally been heard or respected, but also in order to find more creative solutions to some of the problems we'll face going forward. Things like climate change, global pandemics, space travel. These will require cooperation and creativity on a scale that's beyond what we've ever achieved. And it seems that currently we spend so much time in conflict with ourselves and those around us that we never even get to consider some of the real issues that we're facing. So that's the broad level. And I've written an article on our Easygoing Digital website which outlines why I'm so optimistic about the advent of podcasts. Personally, I think podcasts could have implications just as big as Gutenberg's printing press. It has all the same implications in terms of the decentralization of information, but people don't need to be able to read to consume information. I'll link the article in which I make that argument to the podcast page for today, which you can access at www.individuate.com.au. But beyond just the broad application, podcasting and interfacing with these ideas from the perspective of a participant gives us much more than just broad, abstract benefits. There are so many more layers of benefit, right down to being able to create more professional freedom and develop a unique professional legacy. I'm still discovering added layers of benefit to podcasting nearly 5 years in, so it's something that I cannot recommend enough. Even if you don't release anything, having the opportunity to present your ideas gives you a completely different relationship with them. So on the podcast going forward, we won't dive into all these deeper themes all at once, but I'm interested to start introducing some of the aspects from psychology. Episodes will focus on either an aspect of psychology or something that will help us develop our perspective further about something in the outside world. Maybe both, because this idea is so central to podcasts. A deeper perspective allows you to know more about your audience, the people that you're interviewing, others in your field or industry. Even as a listener, you can develop your perspective and find others who share your perspective in different ways. More to the point, you can find others who don't share your perspective, so you can grow your understanding in new and different ways. So apart from the psychology element, we'll use the idea of deconstruction to try and learn as much as we can about as many fields as possible. I'm keen to speak to academics, authors, athletes, journalists, historians, entrepreneurs, politicians, other creatives, and people with interesting perspectives. Because it seems to me, the more that we can learn about the world, the more that we can define and be fulfilled by our own place within it. Plus, an understanding of psychology also seems to be essential because of how much it affects our perceptions. Now, I'm not someone who's really had a particular mantra or just one quote that I live by, but if there's anything that I've ever heard that's resonated more than any other, it's a quote that I remember hearing in early high school when a mate said to me that we should strive to know something about everything and everything about something. Now, obviously that's an unattainable goal, but I think that the way that that quote resonated is part of what drew me to podcasts, and it's something that I'm keen to explore with you as Individuate goes on. So hopefully this podcast will be useful for everyone wanting to improve as a podcast host and develop their perspective. But there's elements of the portrayal of the news, politics, and parts of social media that seem to me to have gotten a bit out of control. And our barrier against some of that lunacy is truth. But truth is a pretty loaded and I think potentially misunderstood word these days. So I'll go with perspective. So essentially the idea is to be a resource for a podcast host, to help develop your perspective about as many things as possible. But even if you don't have a podcast, this information will hopefully still be useful for you too. In saying that, I do think it's important to have a creative interface that you actually put out there, even if it's not a podcast, and even if you only show a few select people. Now the final point that I want to make about all this is that in developing a broader perspective, we can disagree with someone and still take bits and pieces from them. It seems to me that there's so much blanket negativity these days. People disagree with someone and think that that excludes them from having anything to offer at all. In having more understanding about people's perspectives, we can understand what motivating factors lay underneath and better communicate with those around us. And plus, better understand different perspectives that we hear. And that's pretty much all that we have for today. Before we go, I just want to touch on some of how all this came about. As I mentioned last week, I've got a new podcast that will be coming out really soon with another podcaster, Tim Beanland of the Experts Blueprint podcast. The new podcast is called Podcasting Deconstructed. You may recognize the terminology, but in Podcasting Deconstructed, we'll go through all the little things that will help enable you as a podcaster. Last week we spoke about the pragmatic and perspective elements of podcasting. Well, that podcast will be focused on the pragmatic side. That'll leave us to focus more on the perspective. Because to me, that's the real meat and potatoes in terms of the interesting stuff. And the pragmatic elements just enable the perspective. So if that's what you're interested in, Podcasting Deconstructed is the new podcast for you. I'll put up the artwork on the episode page for today, and I'll let you know when it's out. Tim and I also have a range of exciting announcements to come with the new podcast too. So follow Individuate on your favourite podcast player and you'll be the first to know about anything that happens. To finish today's episode, I want to go back to something I spoke about in the Edith Cowan episode of the podcast. I finished that episode with my favourite poem, and I want to go back to just the first part of that today, because to me, it speaks to the importance of developing our perspective, both about the world around us and how we, and the other people that live within it, have the potential to react. The first verse of Rudyard Kipling's poem If reads, "If you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you, if you can trust yourself when all men doubt you, but make allowance for their doubting too, if you can wait and not be tired of waiting, or being lied about, don't deal in lies, or hate, don't give way to hating, and yet don't look too good, nor talk too wise." To me, that's what some of this is about. And with podcasts, we have more opportunity to monetize and spend more time on these ideas than ever before. So why not give it a crack? But that's all we've got time for today. I know it was a bit of a deeper episode in terms of some of the philosophy, but I wanted to lay down exactly why I'm doing this. I may not understand all this stuff as much as I'd like to in terms of the quantum or theoretical physics, but we're going to be having some great conversations 200 or 300 episodes in. As always, you can find the episode page along with all the other episode pages at www.individuate.com.au. If you're interested in reading more about the philosophical and psychological elements of these ideas, I'll put up some resources there. For example, the letters between Carl Jung and Wolfgang Pauli are a fascinating example of two incredibly intelligent minds at play. Thanks for spending some time with me today. I hope to do it again on the next episode of Individuate.